Silence. On the short ferry ride from Buckley Bay to Denman Island, Juliet got out of her car and stood at the front of the boat in the summer breeze. A woman standing there recognized her, and they began to talk. It is not unusual for people to take a second look at Juliet and wonder where they've seen her before, and sometimes to remember. She appears regularly on the provincial television channel, interviewing people who are leading singular or notable lives and deftly directing panel discussions on a program called Issues of the Day. Her hair is cut short now, as short as possible, and has taken on a very dark auburn color, matching the frames of her glasses. She often wears black pants, as she does today, and an ivory silk shirt, and sometimes a black jacket. She is what her mother would have called a striking-looking woman. "Forgive me, people must be always bothering you." "It's okay," Juliet says, "except when I've just been to the dentist or something." The woman is about Juliet's age. Long black hair streaked with gray, no makeup, long denim skirt. She lives on Denman, so Juliet asks her what she knows about the Spiritual Balance Center. "Because my daughter is there," Juliet says. "She's been on a retreat there, or taking a course, I don't know what they call it, for 6 months. This is the first time I've got to see her in 6 months. "There are a couple of places like that," the woman says. "They sort of come and go. I don't mean there's anything suspect about them, just that they're generally off in the woods, and don't have much to do with the community. Well, what would be the point of a retreat if they did?" She says that Juliet must be looking forward to seeing her daughter again, and Juliet says yes, very much. "I'm spoiled," she says. "She's 20 years old, my daughter. She'll be 21 this month, actually, and we haven't been apart much." The woman says that she has a son of 20 and a daughter of 18 and another of 15, and there are days when she'd pay them to go on a retreat, singly or all together. Juliet laughs. "Well, I've only the one. Of course, I won't guarantee that I won't be all for shipping her back, given a few weeks." This is the kind of fond but exasperated mother talk she finds it easy to slip into. Juliet is an expert at reassuring responses, but the truth is that Penelope has scarcely ever given her cause for complaint, and if she wanted to be totally honest, at this point she would say that one day without some contact with her daughter is hard to bear, let alone 6 months. Penelope has worked at Banff as a summer chambermaid, and she has gone on bus trips to Mexico, a hitchhiking trip to Newfoundland, but she has always lived with Juliet, and there has never been a 6-month break. "She gives me delight," Juliet could have said. Not that she is one of those song and dance purveyors of sunshine and cheer and looking on the bright side. I hope I brought her up better than that. She has grace and compassion, and she is as wise as if she'd been on this earth for 80 years. Her nature is reflective, not all over the map like mine, somewhat reticent like her father's. She is also angelically pretty. She's like my mother, blonde like my mother, but not so frail. Strong and noble. Molded, I should say, like a caryatid. And contrary to popular notions, I am not even faintly jealous. All this time without her, and with no word from her, because spiritual balance does not allow letters or phone calls, all this time I've been in a sort of desert, and when her message came, I was like an old patch of cracked earth getting a full drink of rain. "Hope to see you Sunday afternoon. It's time." Time to go home was what Juliet hoped this meant, but of course she would leave that up to Penelope. Penelope had drawn a rudimentary map, and Juliet shortly found herself parked in front of an old church, that is, a church building 75 or 80 years old, covered with stucco, not as old or anything like as impressive as churches usually were in the part of Canada where Juliet had grown up. Behind it was a more recent building, with a slanting roof and windows all across its front, Also a simple stage and some seating benches and what looked like a volleyball court with a sagging net. Everything was shabby, and the once cleared patch of land was being reclaimed by juniper and poplars. A couple of people, she could not tell whether men or women, were doing some carpentry work on the stage, and others sat on the benches in separate small groups. All wore ordinary clothes, not yellow robes or anything of that sort. For a few minutes no notice was taken of Juliet's car. Then one of the people on the benches rose and walked unhurriedly towards her, a short, middle-aged man wearing glasses. She got out of the car and greeted him and asked for Penelope. He did not speak. Perhaps there was a rule of silence, but nodded and turned away and went into the church, from which there shortly appeared not Penelope, but a heavy, slow-moving woman with white hair, wearing jeans and a baggy sweater. "What an honor to meet you," she said. "Do come inside. I've asked Donnie to make us some tea." She had a broad, fresh face, a smile both roguish and tender, and what Juliet supposed must be called twinkling eyes. "My name is Joan," she said. Juliet had been expecting an assumed name like Serenity or something with an Eastern flavor, nothing so plain and familiar as Joan. Later, of course, she thought of Pope Joan. "I've got the right place, have I? I'm a stranger on Denman," she said disarmingly. "You know I've come to see Penelope." "Of course, Penelope." Joan prolonged the name, with a certain tone of celebration. The inside of the church was darkened with purple cloth hung over the high windows. The pews and other church furnishings had been removed, and plain white curtains had been strung up to form private cubicles, as in a hospital ward. The cubicle into which Juliet was directed had, however, no bed, just a small table and a couple of plastic chairs, and some open shelves piled untidily with loose papers. "I'm afraid we're still in the process of getting things fixed up in here," Joan said. "Juliet. May I call you Juliet?" "Yes, of course." "I'm not used to talking to a celebrity." Joan held her hands together in a prayer pose beneath her chin. "I don't know whether to be informal or not." "I'm not much of a celebrity." "Oh, you are. Now don't say things like that. And I'll just get it off my chest right away. How I admire you for the work you do. It's a beam in the darkness, the only television worth watching." "Thank you," said Juliet. "I had a note from Penelope." "I know. But I'm sorry to have to tell you, Juliet. I'm very sorry, and I don't want you to be too disappointed. Penelope is not here." The woman says those words, "Penelope is not here," as lightly as possible. You would think that Penelope's absence could be turned into a matter for amused contemplation, even for their mutual delight. Juliet has to take a deep breath. For a moment she cannot speak. Dread pours through her. Foreknowledge. Then she pulls herself back to reasonable consideration of this fact. She fishes around in her bag. "She said she hoped." I know, says Joan. "She did intend to be here, but the fact was she could not." "Where is she? Where did she go?" "I cannot tell you that." "You mean you can't, or you won't?" "I can't. I don't know. But I can tell you one thing that may put your mind at rest. Wherever she has gone, whatever she has decided, it will be the right thing for her. It will be the right thing for her spirituality and her growth." Juliet decides to let this pass. She gags on the word spirituality, which seems to take in, as she often says, everything from prayer wheels to high mass. She never expected that Penelope, with her intelligence, would be mixed up in anything like this. "I just thought I should know," she says, "in case she wanted me to send on any of her things." "Her possessions?" Joan seems unable to suppress a wide smile, though she modifies it at once with an expression of tenderness. Penelope is not very concerned right now about her possessions. Sometimes Juliet has felt, in the middle of an interview, that the person she faces has reserves of hostility that were not apparent before the cameras started rolling. A person whom Juliet has underestimated, whom she has thought rather stupid, may have strength of that sort. Playful but deadly hostility. The thing then is never to show that you are taken aback, never to display any hint of hostility in return. What I mean by growth is our inward growth, of course, Joan says. I understand, says Juliet, looking her in the eye. Penelope has had such a wonderful opportunity in her life to meet interesting people. Goodness, she hasn't needed to meet interesting people. She's grown up with an interesting person. You're her mother. But you know, sometimes there's a dimension that is missing. Grown-up children feel that they've missed out on something. Oh, yes, says Juliet. I know that grown-up children can have all sorts of complaints. Joan has decided to come down hard. The spiritual dimension, I have to say this, was it not altogether lacking in Penelope's life? I take it she did not grow up in a faith-based home. Religion was not a banned subject. We could talk about it. But perhaps it was the way you talked about it. Your intellectual way. If you know what I mean. You are so clever, she adds, kindly. So you say. Juliet is aware that any control of the interview, and of herself, is faltering and may be lost. Not so I say, Juliet. So Penelope says. Penelope is a dear, fine girl, but she has come to us here in great hunger. Hunger for the things that were not available to her in her home. There you were, with your wonderful, busy, successful life. But, Juliet, I must tell you that your daughter has known loneliness. She has known unhappiness. Don't most people feel that, one time or another? Loneliness and unhappiness? It's not for me to say. Oh, Juliet, you are a woman of marvelous insights. I've often watched you on television and I've thought, how does she get right to the heart of things like that, and all the time being so nice and polite to people? I never thought I'd be sitting talking to you face to face, and what's more, that I'd be in a position to help you. I think that maybe you're mistaken about that. You feel hurt. It's natural that you should feel hurt. It's also my own business. Ah, well, perhaps she'll get in touch with you, after all. Penelope did get in touch with Juliet. A couple of weeks later, a birthday card arrived on her own, Penelope's, birthday. The 19th of June. Her 21st birthday. It was the sort of card you send to an acquaintance whose tastes you cannot guess. Not a crude, jokey card, or a truly witty card, or a sentimental card. On the front of it was a small bouquet of pansies, tied by a thin purple ribbon, whose tail spelled out the words, Happy Birthday. These words were repeated inside, with the words, Wishing you a very, added in gold letters above them. And there was no signature. Juliet thought at first that someone had sent this card to Penelope and forgotten to sign it, and that she, Juliet, had opened it by mistake. Someone who had Penelope's name and the date of her birth on file. Her dentist, maybe, or her driving teacher. But when she checked the writing on the envelope, she saw that there had been no mistake. There was her own name, indeed, written in Penelope's own handwriting. Postmarks gave you no clue any more. They all said, Canada Post. Juliet had some idea that there were ways of telling at least which province a letter came from, but for that you would have to consult the post office, go there with the letter, and very likely be called upon to prove your case, your right to the information, and somebody would be sure to recognize her. She went to see her old friend Krista, who had lived in Whale Bay when she herself lived there, even before Penelope was born. Krista was in Kitsilano, in an assisted living facility. She had multiple sclerosis. Her room was on the ground floor, with a small private patio, and Juliet sat with her there, looking out at a sunny bit of lawn and the wisteria all in bloom along the fence that concealed the garbage bins. Juliet told Krista the whole story of the trip to Denman Island. She had told nobody else, and had hoped perhaps not to have to tell anybody. Every day when she was on her way home from work, she had wondered if perhaps Penelope would be waiting in the apartment, or at least that there would be a letter, and then there had been that unkind card, and she had torn it open with her hands shaking. "It means something," Krista said. "It lets you know she's okay. Something will follow. It will. Be patient." Juliet talked bitterly for a while about Mother Shipton. That was what she finally decided to call her, having toyed with and become dissatisfied with Pope Joan. "What bloody chicanery," she said. "What creepiness, nastiness behind the second-rate, sweetly religious facade. It was impossible to imagine Penelope's having been taken in by her." Krista suggested that perhaps Penelope had visited the place because she had considered writing something about it, some sort of investigative journalism, field work, the personal angle, the long-winded personal stuff that was so popular nowadays. "Investigating for 6 months," said Juliet. "Penelope could have figured out Mother Shipton in 10 minutes. "It's weird," admitted Krista. "You don't know more than you're letting on, do you?" said Juliet. "I hate to even ask that. I feel so at sea. I feel stupid. That woman intended me to feel stupid, of course, like the character who blurts out something in a play and everybody turns away because they all know something she doesn't know." "They don't do that kind of play anymore," Krista said. "Now nobody knows anything. No, Penelope didn't take me into her confidence any more than she did you. Why should she? She'd know I'd end up telling you." Juliet was quiet for a moment. Then she muttered sulkily, "There have been things you didn't tell me." "Oh, for God's sake," said Krista, but without any animosity. "Not that again." "Not that again," Juliet agreed. "I'm in a lousy mood, that's all." "Just hold on. One of the trials of parenthood. She hasn't given you many, after all. In a year, this will all be ancient history." Juliet didn't tell her that in the end she had not been able to walk away with dignity. She had turned and cried out beseechingly, furiously, "What did she tell you?" And Mother Shipton was standing there watching her, as if she had expected this. A fat, pitying smile had stretched her closed lips as she shook her head. During the next year, Juliet would get phone calls, now and then, from people who had been friendly with Penelope. Her reply to their inquiries was always the same. Penelope had decided to take a year off. She was traveling. Her traveling agenda was by no means fixed, and Juliet had no way of contacting her, nor any address she could supply. She did not hear from anybody who had been a close friend. This might mean that people who had been close to Penelope knew quite well where she was, or it might be that they too were off on trips to foreign countries, had found jobs in other provinces, were embarked on new lives, too crowded or chancy at present to allow them to wonder about old friends. Old friends, at that stage in life, meaning somebody you had not seen for half a year. Whenever she came in, the first thing Juliet did was to look for the light flashing on her answering machine, the very thing she used to avoid, thinking there would be someone pestering her about her public utterances. She tried various silly tricks to do with how many steps she took to the phone, how she picked it up, how she breathed. Let it be her. Nothing worked. After a while, the world seemed emptied of the people Penelope had known, the boyfriends she had dropped, and the ones who had dropped her, the girls she had gossiped with and probably confided in. She had gone to a private girls' boarding school, Torrance House, rather than to a public high school, and this meant that most of her longtime friends, even those who were still her friends at college, had come from places out of town, some from Alaska or Prince George or Peru. There was no message at Christmas, but in June, another card, very much in the style of the first, not a word written inside. Juliet had a drink of wine before she opened it. Then she threw it away at once. She had spurts of weeping, once in a while of uncontrollable shaking, but she came out of these in quick fits of fury, walking around the house and slapping one fist into her palm. The fury was directed at Mother Shipton, but the image of that woman had faded, and finally Juliet had to recognize that she was really only a convenience. All pictures of Penelope were banished to her bedroom, with sheaves of drawings and crayonings she had done before they left Whale Bay, her books, and the European one-cup coffee maker with the plunger that she had bought as a present for Juliet with the first money she had made in her summer job at McDonald's. Also such whimsical gifts for the apartment as a tiny plastic fan to stick on the refrigerator, a wind-up toy tractor, a curtain of glass beads to hang in the bathroom window. The door of that bedroom was shut, and in time could be passed without disturbance. Juliet gave a great deal of thought to getting out of this apartment, giving herself the benefit of new surroundings, but she said to Krista that she could not do that, because that was the address Penelope had, and a mail could be forwarded for only 3 months, so there would be no place then where her daughter could find her. "She could always get to you at work," said Krista. "Who knows how long I'll be there?" Juliet said. "She's probably in some commune where they're not allowed to communicate, with some guru who sleeps with all the women and sends them out to beg on the streets. If I'd sent her to Sunday school and taught her to say her prayers, this probably wouldn't have happened. I should have. It would have been like an inoculation. I neglected her spirituality. Mother Shipton said so." When Penelope was barely 13 years old, she had gone away on a camping trip to the Kootenay Mountains of British Columbia with a friend from Torrance House and the friend's family. Juliet was in favor of this. Penelope had been at Torrance House for only 1 year, accepted on favorable financial terms because of her mother's once having taught there, and it pleased Juliet that she had already made so firm a friend and been accepted readily by the friend's family. Also that she was going camping, something that regular children did and that Juliet as a child had never had the chance to do. Not that she would have wanted to, being already buried in books, but she welcomed signs that Penelope was turning out to be a more normal sort of girl than she herself had been. Eric was apprehensive about the whole idea. He thought Penelope was too young. He didn't like her going on a holiday with people he knew so little about. And now that she went to boarding school, they saw too little of her as it was, so why should that time be shortened? Juliet had another reason. She simply wanted Penelope out of the way for the first couple of weeks of the summer holidays, because the air was not clear between herself and Eric. She wanted things resolved, and they were not resolved. She did not want to have to pretend that all was well for the sake of the child. Eric, on the other hand, would have liked nothing better than to see their trouble smoothed over, hidden out of the way. To Eric's way of thinking, civility would restore good feeling. The semblance of love would be enough to get by on until love itself might be rediscovered, and if there was never anything more than a semblance, well, that would have to do. Eric could manage with that. Indeed he could, thought Juliet, despondently. Having Penelope at home, a reason for them to behave well, for Juliet to behave well, since she was the one, in his opinion, who stirred up all the rancor, that would suit Eric very well. So Juliet told him and created a new source of bitterness and blame, because he missed Penelope badly. The reason for their quarrel was an old and ordinary one. In the spring, through some trivial disclosure and the frankness or possibly the malice of their longtime neighbor Ilo, who had a certain loyalty to Eric's dead wife and some reservations about Juliet, Juliet had discovered that Eric had slept with Krista. Krista had been for a long time her close friend, but she had been, before that, Eric's girlfriend, his mistress, though nobody said that anymore. He had given her up when he asked Juliet to live with him. She had known all about Krista then, and she could not reasonably object to what had happened in the time before she and Eric were together. She did not. What she did object to, what she claimed had broken her heart, had happened after that. But still a long time ago, said Eric. It had happened when Penelope was a year old, and Juliet had taken her back to Ontario. When Juliet had gone home to visit her parents, to visit, as she always pointed out now, to visit her dying mother. When she was away, and loving and missing Eric with every shred of her being, she now believed this, Eric had simply returned to his old habits. At first he confessed to once, drunk, but with further prodding and some drinking in the here and now, he said that possibly it had been more often. Possibly? He could not remember? So many times he could not remember? He could remember. Krista came to see Juliet, to assure her that it had been nothing serious. This was Eric's refrain as well. Juliet told her to go away and never come back. Krista decided that now would be a good time to go to see her brother in California. Juliet's outrage at Krista was actually something of a formality. She did understand that a few rolls in the hay with an old girlfriend, Eric's disastrous description, his ill-judged attempt to minimize things, were nowhere near as threatening as a hot embrace with some woman newly met. Also, her outrage at Eric was so fierce and irrepressible as to leave little room for blame of anybody else. Her contentions were that he did not love her, had never loved her, had mocked her with Krista behind her back. He had made her a laughingstock in front of people like Ilo, who had always hated her, that he had treated her with contempt. He regarded the love she felt, or had felt, for him with contempt. He had lived a lie with her. Sex meant nothing to him, or at any rate it did not mean what it meant, had meant, to her. He would have it off with whoever was handy. Only the last of these contentions had the least germ of truth in it, and in her quieter states she knew that. But even that little truth was enough to pull everything down around her. It shouldn't do that, but it did. And Eric was not able, in all honesty, he was not able to see why that should be so. He was not surprised that she should object, make a fuss, even weep, though a woman like Krista would never have done that. But that she should really be damaged, that she should consider herself bereft of all that had sustained her, and for something that had happened 12 years ago, this he could not understand. Sometimes he believed that she was shamming, making the most of it, and at other times he was full of real grief that he had made her suffer. Their grief aroused them, and they made love magnificently. And each time he thought that would be the end of it. Their miseries were over. Each time he was mistaken. In bed, Juliet laughed and told him about Pepys and Mrs. Pepys, inflamed with passion under similar circumstances, since more or less giving up on her classical studies. She was reading widely, and nowadays everything she read seemed to have to do with adultery. Never so often and never so hot, Pepys had said, though he recorded as well that his wife had also thought of murdering him in his sleep. Juliet laughed about this, but half an hour later, when he came to say goodbye before going out in the boat to check his prawn traps, she showed a stony face and gave him a kiss of resignation, as if he'd been going to meet a woman out in the middle of the bay and under a rainy sky. There was more than rain. The water was hardly choppy when Eric went out. But later in the afternoon a wind came up suddenly from the southeast and tore up the waters of Desolation Sound and Malaspina Strait. It continued almost till dark, which did not really close down until around 11 o'clock in this last week of June. By then a sailboat from Campbell River was missing, with 3 adults and 2 children aboard. Also 2 fish boats, one with 2 men aboard and the other with only 1 man, Eric. The next morning was calm and sunny. The mountains, the waters, the shores, all sleek and sparkling. It was possible, of course, that none of these people were lost, that they had found shelter and spent the night in any of the multitude of little bays. That was more likely to be true of the fishermen than of the family in the sailboat, who were not local people, but vacationers from Seattle. Boats went out at once that morning to search the mainland and island shores and the water. The drowned children were found first, in their life jackets, and by the end of the day the bodies of their parents were located as well. A grandfather who had accompanied them was not found until the day after. The bodies of the men who had been fishing together never showed up, though the remnants of their boat washed up near Refuge Cove. Eric's body was recovered on the 3rd day. Juliet was not allowed to see it. Something had got at him, it was said, meaning some animal, after the body was washed ashore. It was perhaps because of this, because there was no question of viewing the body and no need for an undertaker, that the idea caught hold amongst Eric's old friends and fellow fishermen of burning Eric on the beach. Juliet did not object to this. A death certificate had to be made out, so the doctor who came to Whale Bay once a week was telephoned at his office in Powell River, and he gave Ilo, who was his weekly assistant and a registered nurse, the authority to do this. There was plenty of driftwood around, plenty of the sea-salted bark which makes a superior fire. In a couple of hours all was ready. News had spread, somehow, even at such short notice. Women began arriving with food. It was Ilo who took charge. Her Scandinavian blood, her upright carriage and flowing white hair, seeming to fit her naturally for the role of widow of the sea. Children ran about on the logs and were shooed away from the growing pyre, the shrouded, surprisingly meager bundle that was Eric. A coffee urn was supplied to this half-pagan ceremony by the women from one of the churches, and cartons of beer, bottles of drink of all sorts, were left discreetly, for the time being, in the trunks of cars and cabs of trucks. The question arose of who would speak, and who would light the pyre. They asked Juliet, would she do it? And Juliet, brittle and busy, handing out mugs of coffee, said that they had it wrong. As the widow, she was supposed to throw herself into the flames. She actually laughed as she said this, and those who had asked her backed off, afraid that she was getting hysterical. The man who had partnered Eric most often in the boat agreed to do the lighting, but said he was no speaker. It occurred to some that he would not have been a good choice anyway, since his wife was an evangelical Anglican, and he might have felt obliged to say things which would have distressed Eric if he had been able to hear them. Then Ilo's husband offered. He was a little man disfigured by a fire on a boat years ago, a grumbling socialist and atheist, and in his talk he rather lost track of Eric, except to claim him as a brother in the battle. He went on at surprising length, and this was ascribed afterwards to the suppressed life he led under the rule of Ilo. There might have been some restlessness in the crowd before his recital of grievances got stopped, some feeling that the event was turning out to be not so splendid or solemn or heart-rending as might have been expected. But when the fire began to burn, this feeling vanished, and there was great concentration, even or especially among the children, until the moment when one of the men cried, "Get the kids out of here!" This was when the flames had reached the body, bringing the realization, coming rather late, that consumption of fat, of heart and kidneys and liver, might produce explosive or sizzling noises disconcerting to hear. so a good many of the children were hauled away by their mothers, some willingly, some to their own dismay. So the final act of the fire became a mostly male ceremony, and slightly scandalous, even if not, in this case, illegal. Juliet stayed, wide-eyed, rocking on her haunches, face pressed against the heat. She was not quite there. She thought of whoever it was, Trelawney, snatching Shelley's heart out of the flames, the heart with its long history of significance. Strange to think how even at that time, not so long ago, one fleshly organ should be thought so precious, the site of courage and love. It was just flesh, burning. Nothing connected with Eric. Penelope knew nothing of what was going on. There was a short item in the Vancouver paper, not about the burning on the beach, of course, just about the drowning, but no newspapers or radio reports reached her, deep in the Kootenay Mountains. When she got back to Vancouver, she phoned home, from her friend Heather's house. Krista answered. She had got back too late for the ceremony, but was staying with Juliet and helping as she could. Krista said that Juliet was not there, it was a lie, and asked to speak to Heather's mother. She explained what had happened, and said that she was driving Juliet to Vancouver. They would leave at once, and Juliet would tell Penelope herself when they got there. Krista dropped Juliet at the house where Penelope was, and Juliet went inside alone. Heather's mother left her in the sunroom, where Penelope was waiting. Penelope received the news with an expression of fright, then, when Juliet rather formally put her arms around her, of something like embarrassment. Perhaps in Heather's house, in the white and green and orange sunroom, with Heather's brothers shooting baskets in the backyard, news so dire could hardly penetrate. The burning was not mentioned. In this house and neighborhood it would surely have seemed uncivilized, grotesque. In this house, also, Juliet's manner was sprightly beyond anything intended, her behavior close to that of a good sport. Heather's mother entered after a tiny knock, with glasses of iced tea. Penelope gulped hers down and went to join Heather, who had been lurking in the hall. Heather's mother then had a talk with Juliet. She apologized for intruding with practical matters, but said the time was short. She and Heather's father were driving east in a few days' time to see relatives. They would be gone for a month, and had planned to take Heather with them. The boys were going to camp, but now Heather had decided she did not want to go. She had begged to stay here in the house with Penelope. A 14-year-old and a 13-year-old could not really be left alone, and it had occurred to her that Juliet might like some time away, a respite after what she had been through, after her loss and tragedy. So Juliet shortly found herself living in a different world, in a large, spotless house, brightly and thoughtfully decorated, with what are called conveniences, but to her were luxuries, on every hand. This on a curving street, lined with similar houses, behind trimmed bushes and showy flower beds. Even the weather, for that month, was flawless, warm, breezy, bright. Heather and Penelope went swimming, played badminton in the backyard, went to the movies, baked cookies, gorged, dieted, worked on their tans, filled the house with music whose lyrics seemed to Juliet sappy and irritating, sometimes invited girlfriends over, did not exactly invite boys, but held long, taunting, aimless conversations with some who passed the house or had collected next door. By chance, Juliet heard Penelope say to one of the visiting girls, "Well, I hardly knew him, really." She was speaking about her father. How strange. She had never been afraid to go out in the boat, as Juliet was, when there was a chop on the water. She had pestered him to be taken, and was often successful. When following after Eric, in her businesslike orange life jacket, carrying what gear she could manage, she always wore an expression of particular seriousness and dedication. She took note of the setting of the traps, and became skillful, quick, and ruthless at the deheading and bagging of the catch. At a certain stage of her childhood, say from 8 to 11, She had always said that she was going to go out fishing when she grew up, and Eric had told her there were girls doing that nowadays. Juliet had thought it was possible, since Penelope was bright, but not bookish, and exuberantly physical, and brave. But Eric, out of Penelope's hearing, said that he hoped the idea would wear off. He wouldn't wish the life on anybody. He always spoke this way, about the hardship and uncertainty of the work he had chosen, but took pride, so Juliet thought, in those very things. And now he was dismissed by Penelope, who had recently painted her toenails purple and was sporting a false tattoo on her midriff, he who had filled her life. She dismissed him. But Juliet felt as if she was doing the same. Of course, she was busy looking for a job and a place to live. She had already put the house in Whale Bay up for sale. She could not imagine remaining there. She had sold the truck and given away Eric's tools and such traps as had been recovered, and the dinghy. Eric's grown son from Saskatchewan had come and taken the dog. She had applied for a job in the reference department of the college library and a job in the public library, and she had a feeling she would get one or the other. She looked at apartments in the Kitsilano or Dunbar or Point Grey areas. The cleanness, tidiness, and manageability of city life kept surprising her. This was how people lived, where the man's work did not take place out of doors, and where various operations connected with it did not end up indoors, and where the weather might be a factor in your mood, but never in your life, where such dire matters as the changing habits and availability of prawns and salmon were merely interesting or not remarked upon at all. The life she had been leading at Whale Bay, such a short time ago, seemed haphazard, cluttered, exhausting by comparison. And she herself was cleansed of the moods of the last months. She was brisk and competent and better looking. Eric should see her now. She thought about Eric in this way all the time. It was not that she failed to realize that Eric was dead. That did not happen for a moment. But nevertheless, she kept constantly referring to him, in her mind, as if he was still the person to whom her existence mattered more than it could to anyone else. As if he was still the person in whose eyes she hoped to shine. Also the person to whom she presented arguments, information, surprises. This was such a habit with her, and took place so automatically, that the fact of his death did not seem to interfere with it. Nor was their last quarrel entirely resolved. She held him to account still for his betrayal. When she flaunted herself a little now, it was against that. The storm, the recovery of the body, the burning on the beach, that was all like a pageant she had been compelled to watch and compelled to believe in, which still had nothing to do with Eric and herself. She got the job in the reference library. She found a 2-bedroom apartment that she could just afford. Penelope went back to Torrance House as a day student. Their affairs at Whale Bay were wound up, their life there finished. Even Krista was moving out, coming to Vancouver in the spring. On a day before that, a day in February, Juliet stood in the shelter at the campus bus stop when her afternoon's work was over. The day's rain had stopped. There was a band of clear sky in the west, red where the sun had gone down, out over the Strait of Georgia. This sign of the lengthening days, the promise of the change of season, had an effect on her that was unexpected and crushing. She realized that Eric was dead. As if all this time, while she was in Vancouver, he had been waiting somewhere, waiting to see if she would resume her life with him. As if being with him was an option that had stayed open. Her life since she came here had still been lived against a backdrop of Eric, without her ever quite understanding that Eric did not exist. Nothing of him existed. The memory of him in the daily and ordinary world was in retreat. So this is grief. She feels as if a sack of cement has been poured into her and quickly hardened. She can barely move. Getting onto the bus, getting off the bus, walking half a block to her building. Why is she living here? is like climbing a cliff, and now she must hide this from Penelope. At the supper table, she began to shake, but could not loosen her fingers to drop the knife and fork. Penelope came around the table and pried her hands open. She said, "It's Dad, isn't it?" Juliet afterwards told a few people, such as Krista, that these seemed the most utterly absolving, the most tender words that anybody had ever said to her. Penelope ran her cool hands up and down the insides of Juliet's arms. She phoned the library the next day to say that her mother was sick, and she took care of her for a couple of days, staying home from school until Juliet recovered, or until, at least, the worst was over. During those days, Juliet told Penelope everything. Krista, the fight, the burning on the beach, which she had so far managed almost miraculously to conceal from her. Everything. "I shouldn't burden you with all this." Penelope said, "Yeah, well, maybe not," but added staunchly, "I forgive you. I guess I'm not a baby." Juliet went back into the world. The sort of fit she had had in the bus stop recurred, but never so powerfully. Through her research work in the library, she met some people from the provincial television channel and took a job they offered. She had worked there for about a year when she began to do interviews. All the indiscriminate reading she'd done for years, and that Ilo had so disapproved of in the days at Whale Bay, all the bits and pieces of information she'd picked up, her random appetite and quick assimilation were now to come in handy. And she cultivated a self-deprecating, faintly teasing manner that usually seemed to go over well. On camera, few things fazed her, though in fact she would go home and march back and forth, letting out whimpers or curses as she recalled some perceived glitch or fluster or, worse still, a mispronunciation. After 5 years, the birthday cards stopped coming. "It doesn't mean anything," Krista said. "All they were for was to tell you she's alive somewhere. Now she figures you've got the message. She trusts you not to send some tracker after her. That's all." "Did I put too much on her?" "Oh, Jewel." "I don't mean just with Eric dying. Other men, later. I let her see too much misery. My stupid misery." For Juliet had had 2 affairs during the years that Penelope was between 14 and 21, and during both of these she had managed to fall hectically in love, though she was ashamed afterwards. One of the men was much older than she, and solidly married. The other was a good deal younger, and was alarmed by her ready emotions. Later she wondered at these herself. She really had cared nothing for him, she said. "I wouldn't think you did," said Krista, who was tired. "I don't know." "Oh, Christ, I was such a fool. I don't get like that about men any more, do I?" Krista did not mention that this might be because of a lack of candidates. "No, Jewel, no." "Actually, I didn't do anything so terrible," Juliet said then, brightening up. "Why do I keep lamenting that it's my fault? She's a conundrum, that's all. I need to face that. A conundrum and a cold fish," she said, in a parody of resolution. "No," said Krista. "No," said Juliet. "No, that's not true." After the 2nd June had passed without any word, Juliet decided to move. For the first 5 years, she told Krista, she had waited for June, wondering what might come. The way things were now, she had to wonder every day, and be disappointed every day. She moved to a high-rise building in the West End. She meant to throw away the contents of Penelope's room, but in the end she stuffed it all into garbage bags and carried it with her. She had only 1 bedroom now, but there was storage space in the basement. She took up jogging in Stanley Park. Now she seldom mentioned Penelope, even to Krista. She had a boyfriend, that was what you called them now, who had never heard anything about her daughter. Krista grew thinner and moodier. Quite suddenly, One January, she died. You don't go on forever appearing on television. However agreeable the viewers have found your face, there comes a time when they'd prefer somebody different. Juliet was offered other jobs, researching, writing voiceover for nature shows, but she refused them cheerfully, describing herself as in need of a total change. She went back to classical studies, an even smaller department than it used to be. She meant to resume writing her thesis for her Ph.D. She moved out of the high-rise apartment and into a bachelor flat to save money. Her boyfriend had got a teaching job in China. Her flat was in the basement of a house, but the sliding doors at the back opened out at ground level. And there she had a little brick-paved patio, a trellis with sweet peas and clematis, herbs and flowers in pots. For the first time in her life, and in a very small way, she was a gardener, as her father had been. Sometimes people said to her, in stores or on the campus bus, "Excuse me, but your face is so familiar," or, "Aren't you the lady that used to be on television?" But after a year or so, this passed. She spent a lot of time sitting and reading, drinking coffee at sidewalk tables, and nobody noticed her. She let her hair grow out. During the years that it had been dyed red, it had lost the vigor of its natural brown. It was a silvery brown now, fine and wavy. She was reminded of her mother, Sarah's soft, fair, fly-away hair, going gray and then white. She did not have room to have people to dinner any more, and she had lost interest in recipes. She ate meals that were nourishing enough, but monotonous. Without exactly meaning to, she lost contact with most of her friends. It was no wonder. She lived now a life as different as possible from the life of the public, vivacious, concerned, endlessly well-informed woman that she had been. She lived amongst books, reading through most of her waking hours and being compelled to deepen, to alter, whatever premise she had started with. She often missed the world news for a week at a time. She had given up on her thesis and become interested in some writers referred to as the Greek novelists, whose work came rather late in the history of Greek literature, starting in the 1st century BCE, as she had now learned to call it, and continuing into the early Middle Ages. Aristides, Longus, Heliodorus, Achilles Tatius. Much of their work is lost or fragmentary, and is also reported to be indecent, but there is a romance written by Heliodorus, and called the Ethiopica, originally in a private library, retrieved at the siege of Buda, that has been known in Europe since it was printed at Basel in 1534. In this story, the Queen of Ethiopia gives birth to a white baby and is afraid she will be accused of adultery, so she gives the child, a daughter, into the care of the gymnosophists, that is, the naked philosophers, who are hermits and mystics. The girl, who is called Charicleia, is finally taken to Delphi, where she becomes one of the priestesses of Artemis. There she meets a noble Thessalian named Theagenes, who falls in love with her and, with the help of a clever Egyptian, carries her off. The Ethiopian queen, as it turns out, has never ceased to long for her daughter and has hired this very Egyptian to search for her. Mischance and adventures continue until all the main characters meet at Meroe, and Charicleia is rescued, again, just as she is about to be sacrificed by her own father. Interesting themes were thick as flies here, and the tale had a natural continuing fascination for Juliet, particularly the part about the gymnosophists. She tried to find out as much as she could about these people, who were usually referred to as Hindu philosophers. Was India, in this case, presumed to be adjacent to Ethiopia? No, Heliodorus came late enough to know his geography better than that. The gymnosophists would be wanderers, far spread, attracting and repelling those they lived amongst with their ironclad devotion to purity of life and thought, their contempt for possessions, even for clothing and food. A beautiful maiden reared amongst them might well be left with some perverse hankering for a bare, ecstatic life. Juliet had made a new friend named Larry. He taught Greek, and he had let Juliet store the garbage bags in the basement of his house. He liked to imagine how they might make the Ethiopica into a musical. Juliet collaborated in this fantasy, even to making up the marvelously silly songs and the preposterous stage effects, but she was secretly drawn to devising a different ending. One that would involve renunciation and a backward search in which the girl would be sure to meet fakes and charlatans, impostors, shabby imitations of what she was really looking for, which was reconciliation, at last, with the erring, repentant, essentially great-hearted queen of Ethiopia. Juliet was almost certain that she had seen Mother Shipton here in Vancouver. She had taken some clothes that she would never wear again. Her wardrobe had grown increasingly utilitarian, to a Salvation Army thrift store, and as she set the bag down in the receiving room, she saw a fat old woman in a muumuu fixing tags onto trousers. The woman was chatting with the other workers. She had the air of a supervisor, a cheerful but vigilant overseer, or perhaps the air of a woman who would assume that role whether she had any official superiority or not. If she was in fact Mother Shipton, she had come down in the world, but not by very much, for if she was Mother Shipton, would she not have reserves of buoyancy and self-approbation, such as to make real downfall impossible? Reserves of advice, pernicious advice, as well. She has come to us here in great hunger. Juliet had told Larry about Penelope. She had to have one person who knew. "Should I have talked to her about a noble life?" she said. "Sacrifice, opening your life to the needs of strangers? I never thought of it. I must have acted as if it would have been good enough if she'd turned out like me. Would that sicken her?" Larry was not a man who wanted anything from Juliet but her friendship and good humor. He was what used to be called an old-fashioned bachelor, asexual as far as she could tell, but probably she could not tell far enough, squeamish about any personal revelations, endlessly entertaining. 2 other men had appeared who wanted her as a partner. One of them she had met when he sat down at her sidewalk table. He was a recent widower. She liked him, but his loneliness was so raw and his pursuit of her so desperate that she became alarmed. The other man was Krista's brother, whom she had met several times during Krista's life. His company suited her. In many ways he was like Krista. His marriage had ended long ago. He was not desperate. She knew from Krista that there had been women ready to marry him whom he had avoided. But he was too rational. His choice of her verged on being cold-blooded. There was something humiliating about it. But why humiliating? It was not as if she loved him. It was while she was still seeing Krista's brother, his name was Gary Lamb, that she ran into Heather on a downtown street in Vancouver. Juliet and Gary had just come out of a theater where they had seen an early evening movie, and they were talking about where to go for dinner. It was a warm night in summer, the light still not gone from the sky. A woman detached herself from a group on the sidewalk. She came straight at Juliet. A thin woman, perhaps in her late 30s, fashionable, with taffy streaks in her dark hair. "Mrs. Porteous? Mrs. Porteous!" Juliet knew the voice, though she would never have known the face. Heather. "This is incredible," Heather said. "I'm here for 3 days, and I'm leaving tomorrow. My husband's at a conference. I was thinking that I don't know hardly anybody here anymore, and then I turn around and see you." Juliet asked her where she was living now, and she said Connecticut. "And just about 3 weeks ago I was visiting Josh. You remember my brother Josh? I was visiting my brother Josh and his family in Edmonton, and I ran into Penelope. Just like this, on the street. No, actually, it was in the mall, that humongous mall they have. She had a couple of her kids with her. She'd brought them down to get uniforms for that school they go to. The boys. We were both flabbergasted. I didn't know her right away, but she recognized me. She'd flown down, of course, from that place way up north, but she says it's quite civilized, really, and she said you were still living here. But I'm with these people. They're my husband's friends, and I really haven't had time to ring you up." Juliet made some gesture to say that of course there would not be time, and she had not expected to be rung up. She asked how many children Heather had. "3. They're all monsters. I hope they grow up in a hurry. But my life's a picnic compared with Penelope's. 5. "Yes." "I have to run now. We're going to see a movie. I don't even know anything about it. I don't even like French movies, but it was altogether great meeting you like this. My mother and Dad moved to White Rock. They used to see you all the time on TV. They used to brag to their friends that you'd lived in our house. They say you're not on anymore. Did you get sick of it?" "Something like that." I'm coming." She hugged and kissed Juliet, the way everybody did now, and ran to join her companions. So, Penelope did not live in Edmonton. She had come down to Edmonton. Flown down. That meant she must live in Whitehorse or in Yellowknife. Where else was there that she could describe as quite civilized? Maybe she was being ironical, mocking Heather a bit when she said that. She had 5 children, and 2 at least were boys. They were being outfitted with school uniforms. That meant a private school. That meant money. Heather had not known her at first. Did that mean she had aged? That she was out of shape after 5 pregnancies? That she had not taken care of herself? As Heather had. As Juliet had, to a certain extent. That she was one of those women to whom the whole idea of such a struggle seemed ridiculous, a confession of insecurity, or just something she had no time for, far outside of her consideration. Juliet had thought of Penelope being involved with transcendentalists, of her having become a mystic, spending her life in contemplation, or else rather the opposite, but still radically simple and Spartan, earning her living in a rough and risky way, fishing, perhaps with a husband, perhaps also with some husky little children, in the cold waters of the Inside Passage off the British Columbia coast. Not at all. She was living the life of a prosperous, practical matron, married to a doctor, maybe, or to one of those civil servants managing the northern parts of the country during the time when their control is being gradually, cautiously, but with some fanfare, relinquished to the native people. If she ever met Penelope again, they might laugh about how wrong Juliet had been. When they told about their separate meetings with Heather, how weird that was, they would laugh. No, the fact was surely that she had already laughed too much around Penelope. Too many things had been jokes, just as too many things, personal things, loves that were maybe just gratification, had been tragedies. She had been lacking in motherly inhibitions and propriety and self-control. Penelope had said that she, Juliet, was still living in Vancouver. She had not told Heather anything about the breach. Surely not. If she had been told, Heather would not have spoken so easily. How did Penelope know that she was still here? Unless she checked in the phone directory. And if she did, what did that mean? Nothing. Don't make it mean anything. She walked to the curb to join Gary, who had tactfully moved away from the scene of the reunion. Whitehorse, Yellowknife. It was painful indeed to know the names of those places. Places she could fly to. Places where she could loiter in the streets, devise plans for catching glimpses. But she was not so mad. She must not be so mad. At dinner, she thought that the news she had just absorbed put her into a better situation for marrying Gary, or living with him, whatever it was he wanted. There was nothing to worry about or hold herself in wait for concerning Penelope. Penelope was not a phantom. She was safe, as far as anybody is safe, and she was probably as happy as anybody is happy. She had detached herself from Juliet, and very likely from the memory of Juliet, and Juliet could not do better than to detach herself in turn. But she had told Heather that Juliet was living in Vancouver. Did she say Juliet? Or mother? My mother. Juliet told Gary that Heather was the child of old friends. She had never spoken to him about Penelope, and he had never given any sign of knowing about Penelope's existence. It was possible that Krista had told him, and he had remained silent out of a consideration that it was none of his business, or that Krista had told him, and he had forgotten, or that Krista had never mentioned anything about Penelope, not even her name. If Juliet lived with him, the fact of Penelope would never surface. Penelope would not exist. Nor did Penelope exist. The Penelope Juliet sought was gone. The woman Heather had spotted in Edmonton, the mother who had brought her sons to Edmonton to get their school uniforms, who had changed in face and body so that Heather did not recognize her, was nobody Juliet knew. Does Juliet believe this? If Gary saw that she was agitated, he pretended not to notice, but it was probably on this evening that they both understood they would never be together. If it had been possible for them to be together, she might have said to him, "My daughter went away without telling me goodbye, and in fact she probably did not know then that she was going. She did not know it was for good." Then gradually, I believe, it dawned on her how much she wanted to stay away. It is just a way that she has found to manage her life. It's maybe the explaining to me that she can't face, or has not time for, really. You know, we always have the idea that there is this reason or that reason, and we keep trying to find out reasons, and I could tell you plenty about what I've done wrong, but I think the reason may be something not so easily dug out, something like purity in her nature. Yes, some fineness and strictness and purity, some rock-hard honesty in her. My father used to say of someone he disliked that he had no use for that person. Couldn't those words mean simply what they say? Penelope does not have a use for me. Maybe she can't stand me. It's possible. Juliet has friends. Not so many now, but friends. Larry continues to visit, and to make jokes. She keeps on with her studies. The word studies does not seem to describe very well what she does. Investigations would be better. And being short of money, she works some hours a week at the coffee place where she used to spend so much time at the sidewalk tables. She finds this work a good balance for her involvement with the old Greeks, so much so that she believes she wouldn't quit even if she could afford to. She keeps on hoping for a word from Penelope, but not in any strenuous way. She hopes as people who know better hope for undeserved blessings, spontaneous remissions, things of that sort.